As many of you have probably already heard, there are some shocking things going on at the moment. Around 7 million people die due to air pollution every year. Sea level could rise 34 centimeters by 2050. 1 million species are threatened with extinction, and by 2050, the oceans could have more plastic than fish. And these statistics are some of the most famous, often tagged onto environmental messages in the hopes that we can sort of shock people into action, that through one fact or one number, we can alter the way someone lives and make them really care about the planet and its future. But the problem is, humans aren't built like that. We hear statistics, but for most of us, we don't feel them. And if we travel back to February this year, it wasn't statistics that mobilized people to start isolating and wearing masks and taking precautions. It was hearing the stories of our friend's granddad in hospital, the prime minister in the ICU, and an Italian nurse exhausted and bruised from hours on shift. And these stories personalized and reinforced the severity of the virus more than any statistic could ever do. And as Brené Brown says, maybe stories are just data with a soul. And I think that's one of the big problems of the environmental movement right now. We're not conveying the soul of the environmental crisis. So I have a really short time to speak to you today, and I know there's no use in me sitting here telling you about the problem because it's highly likely that you're all already aware of the multiple crises our planet and we, by default, face. So instead, I'm going to speak about how we can pop the bubble that we're in, because it is a bubble. And whatever we do in this bubble or movement will never be enough unless we reach out and bring everyone with us. And the key, I think, is not just what we're telling people is going to happen in the future, but actually how we're telling them. And a recent study showed that the recent IPCC report was less readable than seminal papers by Einstein. And so it's time that those really vital stats are given a face. Since the beginning of lockdown, I've been speaking to young people on Zoom for a book I'm writing called Children of the Anthropocene. And the idea is to tell the stories of the young people who already have the rising sea levels lapping at their doors, the ones who already have to stay out of school because they have to walk for miles to collect water when their local well dries up, and the ones whose local beach is choked by plastic several feet deep. One of these young people I spoke to, she's called Belinda Rickamani, a young woman living on the Solomon Islands, and from her window she has a view of an island called Wolundi Island. Wolundi Island is sort of a window in itself. It's like a window into a likely future. It used to be home to 1,200 inhabitants, and because of rising sea levels and submersion, is now home to only one man, Timothy. He spends the days adding rocks to the walls around his house, trying to hold off the water for just a little bit longer. And the reason he won't move, and I quote, "If I move to the mainland, I can't see anything through the trees. I won't even see the water. I want to have this spot where I can look around me because I'm part of this place," he says. And those words, I think, embody the tragedy of what we're facing. The Solomon Islands have some of the lowest carbon emissions and yet face some of the greatest impacts of the climate crisis. And Timothy is having to choose between either staying in his home on a drowning island or leaving everything he's ever known and starting a completely new life somewhere else because of sea level rise, which he and his community have played little part in causing. And there are several things I think which make that story much more touching than a statistic. It's personal, it's tangible, and it's current. And we as communicators and campaigners and just people who are aware of the crisis need to make sure our communications reflect that. So when you leave this meeting and perhaps you speak to family or friends or colleagues or just followers on social media, make it personal. Uplift the stories of those on the front line. Make it tangible. This great abstract beast which we call the climate crisis is strange because the climate is not really the problem, it's merely a symptom. The problem, rather, is human greed and human apathy. And lastly, make it current. We're not trying to work just to stop something happening in the future. We're actually trying to stop the deforestation which will happen today and tomorrow. the species who will go extinct today and tomorrow, and the lives who will be lost today and tomorrow. And the thing I think which is most important is the fact that Belinda, through her window, sees this microcosm of planetary destruction, and she knows how the story could go, yet she's decided that she's going to rewrite that story. And that, rewriting the narrative, is exactly what we must do. Last year and earlier this year, just before the pandemic and lockdown hit, I was working on a documentary called Animal, and we were meeting people on the front lines tackling the environmental crisis. And when I say environmental crisis, we saw such a huge range of different problems, from plastic pollution to extinction to factory farming to human-wildlife conflict and overuse of pesticides, and at times it felt so insurmountable. But what we also saw around the world was that so many people are striving desperately to find solutions. They're striving to create this new story, which I'm speaking about. And we can see it here in the UK as well. In Sussex, Knepp Estate is a beacon of hope for restoring degraded land to bustling wildlife havens. The English economist Kate Raworth has proposed the revolutionary new donut economics, which works with, not against, the cyclical processes of life. All over the UK, the playing out movement is closing streets for a few hours after school to allow kids and not cars to populate the roads. And the rise of veganism and flexitarian eating has provided a glimpse into an alternative, more sustainable diet for many of us. But it still seems, despite these fragments of a story, we're trying to solve the problem separately, operating in silos, firefighting by stamping on small fires when they're raging all around us. And by operating like this, we appear to be trying to mop up the overflowing bathwater whenever the puddle affects us, when instead we should be uniting to turn off the tap. So if I continue with that analogy, imagine the overflowing bathwater as the rampant deforestation, the families displaced because of anthropogenic natural disasters, the loss of millions of birds in the UK, the death of Malaysia's very last Sumatran rhino, the Australian wildfires, and indeed the pandemic which we're seeing right now, and the pandemics which will come in the future. These are all symptoms, horrifying, terrible symptoms, and the tap of the bath, which we must turn off, is the root cause of these symptoms. It's our inability to change, which I think is driven by our lack of a unifying story of our future. So the last thing I'm going to say, which I think needs changing in how we communicate our message, is the fact that we have these fragments of a story of the future, but our problem is that we don't have enough people united in one place who are supporting the emergence of this new narrative. And I've heard many people say in the last few years, we need to stop talking and we need to start acting. But the moment we stop talking, action is impossible. And that's where conferences such as this one come in. This conference is really just a glorified campfire. And when I leave this virtual stage soon, some incredible people are going to come on. And as we've done since the very beginning, they're going to give you a glimpse into their minds by sharing ideas and stories with you. And when you leave the warmth of this virtual campfire, it's then your job to propagate these stories, to write your own chapter. And simply attending now, simply being a supportive observer is no longer enough. Just recycling, just walking to work or eating one vegetarian meal is not enough. But when these individual changes accumulate and have an impact on political and economic structures, that's when we'll see change. And this is no longer just about transforming our relationship to the natural world, it's about transforming everything. And I think when something is so obvious to us, we assume that it's obvious to everyone. And many of us know here that this world can be a better place whilst also being more sustainable and ethical. But for others, this idea of being green seems like a sacrifice. And so we face two boundaries. One of them we're breaching, and one of them we're respecting. We're breaching the boundaries of the natural world, and we're respecting the boundaries of our imagination. So I think we should turn this around. All of us here, when we leave today, let's help to exceed the collective boundaries of our imagination, but respect the boundaries and the tipping points of the natural world. So I'm going to start. I'm going to exceed the boundaries of imagination, and when you leave, you'll continue. It's 2050. I'm 47, living in a sustainably constructed apartment. On my walk to work, I pass many of our city's shared gardens with a diversity of local food crops. Bus stops and train stations are surrounded by edible food initiatives run by local communities and free for all. Many streets are free of motorised vehicles since employment in the local economies is thriving. Some young children play in the streets where I walk, since play flourished once vehicles diminished. Many front gardens I pass are filled with wildflowers and buzzing with pollinators and insects after governmental incentives encourage greener gardens. Swifts and starlings and sparrows wheel and swing above me since the building regulations introduced integral nest holes and hollow bricks. I pass by a school which has a mandatory area designated to nature and edible crops, and there I see the children watching something trundling across the playground. I recognise the bumbling walk immediately. It's a hedgehog. At work, the news is on. They're talking about insect populations rising and something called the windshield phenomenon. Not that it affects us, since the investment in efficient and affordable public transport happened, and car use is few and far between anyway. It's an idealistic utopia, this imagined scenario, but it is possible. And after denouncing the system for about 5 or 6 years now, I already feel tired of just waiting for governments, only for them to come up with insufficient solutions to monumental problems. So whilst the campaigning continues, let's also create the solutions and shape the framework so that governments and corporations can't help but change. Because I can assure you that change is coming whether we like it or not. So let's make sure it's us that changes and not our planet. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bella. That was so incredible. We'd like to ask you a few questions if you've got a bit more time. The first of which was, you spoke about how statistics often aren't enough to awaken us to the issues we're facing. Can you tell us what then made you realise the need to fight the climate crisis?
So I began the campaigning when I was about 11, and it was actually because it was one video which sort of catalysed this desire in me to start campaigning, and it was about palm oil and the effects on orangutans. And the thing which I think really touched me was in the video, it showed this mother orangutan in the middle of this palm oil plantation. And as humans, when we see one individual suffering or one animal, we find it very easy to empathize with that individual animal. So I think for me, it was just that one video. And from there, I began to learn more about, originally it was just palm oil and deforestation. And then I learned about the connection between deforestation and climate, and it sort of snowballed. But it's amazing how it all began with that one video, with that one individual.
That's great. I very much hear that. Bella, how do you think we can communicate this message with young people, especially those in lower income and minority groups who are not so aware as you are? What are the most effective channels, and how do we truly engage with them?
In a way, I would have to sort of subvert that, because I think lots of young people are aware now. And in a way, the challenges that we're facing, from speaking to many young people, the challenge is, how do we convey this message to older people? And particularly to those in power, to corporations and governments. And if they're already aware, how do we make them transform that awareness into action? So I would say, in terms of the channels to use, obviously using social media, I know Jane will definitely speak about this, but it's much more accessible to reach different people now. And at our fingertips, we have this incredible resource where we can reach people all over the world. And that the use of social media has been the thing which has allowed for the climate strikes, and it's allowed for these communities of young activists to form all over the world. So I would say definitely use that, but actually don't worry as much about involving young people, because we're really involving ourselves. And the challenge, I think, is finding ways for the generations to work together rather than in silos.
Excellent, thank you, Bella. And yeah, that answers one of our other questions that came in, that was how do we unite the generations? So thank you for that. Another question is, how can we support you in the work that you're doing? You're doing such incredible things, and what is it that we can do to amplify voices like yours?
I think what we need to do is, not my voice actually in particular. I think there are lots of young voices on the front line, which I spoke a bit about in the speech. I spoke about the children of the Anthropocene. And there are these young people, particularly in Indigenous communities and minority communities, who have been speaking about the climate crisis, about extinction and deforestation for a while, and their voices haven't been amplified. And now that there's been this sudden rise, voices like mine and like Greta's, these Western activists, we're being amplified. And in a way, we actually need to see more amplification of people on the front line to hear their stories. Because whilst you can hear about the fact that maybe I'm not seeing as many purple fritillaries, or I haven't seen a wild hedgehog, the things that the changes I'm seeing aren't as severe and dramatic as those that people on the front line are seeing. So I would say actually read about those stories, because they are on the internet. They're more buried and they're harder to find, but those are the ones that need to be amplified.
Absolutely, thank you, Bella. So this is the Festival of Wellbeing. So another question is, what do you do to stay grounded and not get overwhelmed with the scale of this challenge?
It is hard at the moment, isn't it? I think the thing I do most is go into nature. I actually live on the outskirts of London, but near me there are lots of parks, and I go to the park a lot. I walk by the river, and I think one thing which I've seen from being with lots of different activists, young of all different ages, is that we sort of get buried in the challenges, and many people forget what they're fighting for, and it leads to burnout, and it's just not sustainable. So if you're fighting for the protection of the natural world, you need to make sure that you can continue to kindle that love and that passion to protect it. Otherwise you will burn out. So take time for yourself, take time to go into nature and continue to feel that passion.
Excellent, thank you, Bella. So another question is, how important is localizing environmental impact and consequences in mobilizing people and connecting to the heart of the destruction of nature?
I think it's one of the most important things we can do. If you look at the most successful campaigns, I saw someone in the chat mention Rob Hopkins, and he founded the Transition Network, which is all about communities coming together. So finding individuals who are passionate, and rather than them just taking small actions in their own life, it's about bringing them together and creating change in the community, with obviously a global focus, with the attempt of with the aim of trying to reduce the impacts of climate change, but actually starting at the community level. And I think we can't sit around and wait for governments, because it will take too long, but we can't just rely on individual actions, because that's not sufficient. But the sort of sweet spot is the community change. And I think that's where most of our focus should be, finding people around us, finding communities where we can begin to amplify those individual changes to something much bigger.
Thank you, Bella. And can you tell us a little bit about who have been your environmental role models?
Funnily enough, one of the greatest is Jane Goodall. She influenced me a lot when I was younger. To have a female role model, and I went to watch one of her speeches when I was younger in London, and I actually knew it almost word for word, because I watched her speak so many times before, and I'd been so inspired by her story of going out to Africa at a time when, that wasn't what was expected of women, and then actually naming the chimpanzees rather than giving them numbers, because she saw them as individuals, not as these sort of generic machines as many scientists did at the time. So it was that defying of boundaries which I think really inspired me.
Amazing. And we'll be hearing more from her later. Another question from the audience is, how do you trigger a reaction from CEOs and company owners? Is making it personal when you ask them or put a question to them enough?
I think the CEOs and the heads of business are there. They're following the consumer demand, and so one of the main things is obviously shifting that demand for something more sustainable, more ethical. And for example, Richard Walker, he's the CEO of Iceland, and he's recognized that people now are looking for much greener, more sustainable alternatives, and he's beginning to change the whole way that Iceland works to fulfill those wants and desires of the customer. So I think we have to continue making it obvious. If you see something unethical and unsustainable happening, then get in contact with the person in charge of that and ask others to do so too, and make sure that you do vocalize if you see something bad happening. Name and shame the companies who are, and the businesses, the supermarkets, whoever's doing it, and make sure everybody knows about that.
Excellent, thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions. You touched on the individual actions and contributions and how they can deliver change, but how that while commitment from individuals is key, we need to go beyond that. And the question is, how can new joiners to personal commitment build a roadmap of where to contribute beyond their initial contribution?
Yeah, I think I sort of touched on it briefly, but it's not about deciding you're going to do individual action or deciding that you're going to do campaigning to try and create systemic change. It's about weaving them all together. So individual action might be, planting vegetables in your garden, but changing that into a more community level action might be creating a community garden, like Rob Hopkins has done in his transition network. And then perhaps you can also transform that into systemic change by helping the local community, helping the local economies by not buying from these big companies like Amazon, by not supporting those. So it's not about choosing one way and then focusing just on that. It's actually about finding ways to weave all those different pathways together.
Excellent. And then I think we'll end on the question, what are your hopes for the future? You kind of told us that story of a few decades down the line, but what are you hoping for at this point in time?
I really hope that we can have a future where we don't see ourselves as so superior to the rest of the natural world. I think recently we have realized, because of the pandemic, that we're not exempt from biological laws, that we're just as vulnerable as all other species. And many people are also realizing, because of the pandemic, that if we continue to destroy nature, then we're going to consequently destroy ourselves, because our fate is sort of bound up with the fate of the natural world. So I hope that maybe in, let's say, 50 years' time, we can actually see ourselves as an integral part of the natural world, just as important and no more important than any other species, and recognize the importance of all other species as well.